The Sunday school lesson for September the 8th, 2024 is Solomon dedicates the temple. 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 22 through 24, verses 37 through 39, verse 46, and verses 48 through 50a. Welcome, viewers and subscribers, to my channel, Read With Me. If you are new here, please know that this is an audio reading of the lesson with intermittent commentary. Verses 22 through 23. Then Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel, spread out his hands toward heaven, and said, The standing posture of prayer Solomon adopts is the most commonly seen in ancient Near Eastern art. Other postures, especially kneeling or prostration, were legitimate, of course. 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 20. And by the same time Solomon concludes the prayer, he will have switched from standing to kneeling. 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 54. The changeover is explained more fully in 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verses 12 through 13. In both postures, the fact that Solomon spread out his hands toward heaven adds an aura of solemnity and earnestness. Daniel chapter 12, verse 7. It reflects the idea of God as being far above creation, not just spatially, but also figuratively. Humans look up to God, seeking help during their hour of need. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 39, and John chapter 8, verse 23. Solomon voiced his prayer not just for his own benefit, but on behalf of the whole assembly of Israel. These were especially those Israelites who were in attendance personally for the temple dedication, 1 Kings chapter 8, verses 1 through 2. Their presence is important partly because they must overhear the exhortations to avoid sin, and partly because God wishes to emphasize the relationship with the people of Israel. They were united with each other and God by their history, present life, and hope for a blessed future. In a sense, they are being dedicated as much as the temple when we note the blessing mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 14, and compare 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 18. Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants who continue wholeheartedly in your way. You have kept your promise to your servant David, my father. With your mouth you have promised, and with your hand you have fulfilled it, as it is today. The following two verses are worded almost identically with 2 Chronicles chapter 6, verses 14 through 15. The confession emphasizes the uniqueness of God, an idea that appears in many biblical texts. Psalms 115, verses 3 through 8, 135, verses 15 through 18. The Lord, the God of Israel, brooks no rivals. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 15 through 20, chapter 5, verse 7. One area of his uniqueness appears in keeping covenant in his merciful love. This language comes from Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 9 and verse 12, and it reflects the direction of that book. While Israelites were responsible for obeying God's commandments, their relationship with God rests primarily upon his covenant promise. It was not earned by human merit. Even so, the verse at hand emphasizes the attitude of the people, as indicated by the Shema, which means hear, in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 5. The people should hear and receive the law Moses with enthusiasm, commitments, and even rejoicing, as emphasized throughout Deuteronomy. Mindless, routine obedience cannot be the goal of the relationship because it is not sustainable. Those who follow God without enthusiasm will stop following at a slight provocation. Matthew chapter 13, verses 1 through 9. The promise to David that his offspring would build the temple, 2 Samuel chapter 17, verse 13, now fulfilled, is evidence of God's faithfulness. The eventual destruction of kingship and even that of the temple did not cancel God's plan for Israel. Rather, God used those events to symbolize his presence as they pointed to greater eternal realities regarding spiritual and heavenly kingship and temple. God may carry out his promises in various ways, but the promises always remain just that. Verses 37 through 39. When famine or plague comes to the land, or blight or mildew, locusts or grasshoppers, or when an enemy besieges them in any of their cities, whatever disaster or disease may come, and when a prayer or plea is made by anyone among your people Israel, being aware of the afflictions of their own hearts, and spreading out their hands toward this temple, then hear from heaven, your dwelling place. Forgive and act. Deal with everyone according to all they do, since you know their hearts, for you alone know every human heart. The Old Testament often summarizes the calamities that may befall God's people in terms of sword, famine, and plague. 1 Chronicles chapter 21 verses 11 through 12, Jeremiah chapter 14 verse 12. These three general categories speak to oppression and or fatalities caused by human adversaries, meager harvests, and disease respectively. Blight, mildew, locusts, and grasshoppers result in famine as crops are destroyed. Psalm 78 verse 46, Amos chapter 4 verse 9, Joel chapter 1 verse 4. These predictions of calamities come from the greatly expanded listing in Deuteronomy chapter 28 verses 15 through 68. Solomon asked God to reply to any prayer offered by those either in the temple or mindful of it. Older translations of this text place the word or between the words anyone and among. There is no basis in the Hebrew text for this word appearing here. Rather, it's the translator's best judgment for smooth reading. On the other hand, the ancient Greek translation, the Septuagint, omits the phrase among your people Israel. The prayer does envision Gentiles praying, beginning in 1 Kings chapter 8 verse 41. But here the focus remains on Israelites as those especially subject to the curses following a violation of the covenant. Again, see Deuteronomy chapter 28. The phrase, the afflictions of their own hearts, speaks to pangs of conscience. 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 5, Romans chapter 2, verse 15, and so on. Each person knows his or her own troubles and can express them in prayer as hands are lifted toward this temple. Compare and contrast Exodus chapter 9, verse 29, Job chapter 11, verse 13, Psalm 88, verse 9, Isaiah chapter 1, verse 15. This may work on two levels. One, the suffering of the people as a whole may be expressed in different ways by different individuals. And two, each person should be aware of his or her details and ably communicate about them to God. In other words, prayer can take many forms. On the one hand, it depends partly on forms shared by the community as a whole over time. On the other hand, it depends partly on individual experience and perception. Humans do well to know their own hearts and minds as God knows them. Compare Hebrews chapter 4, verses 12 through 13. That's an ideal to strive for. although it is impossible to attain since God knows us better than we know ourselves. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verses 28 through 32. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 12. Indeed, we humans have a tendency towards self-deception. 1 John chapter 1 verse 8. If God responds to prayer based on an assessment of need, and he does, see Matthew chapter 6 verse 8 and verse 32, how much more are his responses in reaction to the direction of one's heart? Chapter 13 verse 58. The divine response follows a sequence that begins with an appeal for God to hear. This is a feature in ancient Israelite prayers. Examples: Psalm 5 verse 1, 27 verse 7, 28 verse 2, 54 verse 2, 64 verse 1. Contrast 22 verse 2. Lamentations chapter 3 verse 8 and verse 44. Then God forgives, since a request for help usually accompanies self-assessment and turning away from sin. Then God acts appropriately. This sequence is relevant because the moral and spiritual ground must be cleared before action occurs. At the same time, God does assess the ways of the person praying. Wicked people who defy God's call cannot utter legitimate prayers. That's because their intention is not to change their ways, but to escape some immediate trial. See Proverbs chapter 15, verse 29, Isaiah chapter 58, verses 1 through 9, Hosea chapter 6, verse 1 through chapter 7, verse 16, and 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8. The verse also insists that God knows the thoughts of all people, not just Israelites. This insight leads to the expectation that Gentiles may also pray toward the temple and ask for God's help. Verse 46. When they sin against you, for there is no one who does not sin, and you become angry with them and give them over to their enemies, who take them captive to their own lands, far away or near. In verse 46, the prayer takes an important turn, assuming that the people may sin so grievously that the covenant might fall as the Israelites are removed from their promised land. This event did occur. However, the prediction goes beyond the curses for disobedience in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 15 through 68, to promises of prosperity in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 through 10. These envision the loss of the land as a punishment and the return to it as an effect of God's mercy, respectively. The relationship between God and Israel was not based on human achievement, but on God's love and kindness. So the prayer ends with a request that God will renew the people even after their communal sins have resulted in the curses of Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 15 through 68. Even the collapse of their culture ought not to be the last word. God remains just and punishes sins, but he also shows mercy. This verse should not be read as an excuse for sin. God knows I'm human and will forgive me. A sentence often heard in Christian circles is a statement of extreme arrogance and careless indifference to the moral and spiritual demands of faith. It is not a statement honoring God or taking human duties or capacities seriously. It distorts Solomon's point here. The prayer does not ask for cheap grace because it accepts the reality of punishment for sin. Verses 48 through 58. And if they turn back to you with all their heart and soul in the land of their enemies who took them captive, and pray to you toward the land you gave their ancestors, toward the city you have chosen, and the temple I have built for your name, then from heaven, your dwelling place, hear their prayer and their plea, and uphold their cause, and forgive your people who have sinned against you. Forgive all the offenses they have committed against you. In verse 48, this part of Solomon's prayer assumes that suffering will cause people to reflect on their lives and amend them. It also assumes that God will hear their prayers of repentance when uttered in a land of exile. This means, in turn, that God's presence is universal and that He is interested in the prayers of people seeking change and redemption. The verse also reveals the idea of praying toward the temple in Jerusalem. It may be the earliest evidence for that practice. Much later, Daniel prayed facing Jerusalem while in Babylon, Daniel chapter 6, verse 10. This practice shows how posture indicates the direction of the heart. A good and bad example of this is Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 16, which describes about 25 men who, with their backs toward the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east, were bowing down to the sun in the east. It's one thing to hear, but another thing to heed. See the distinction in Ezekiel chapter 33, verses 4 through 5. We see both elements in this prayer. With the request to uphold their cause as the heeding part, the cause has been given to the Israelites by God. It is the very reason for the existence of their nation. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6. Thus, the prayer ultimately is that God's will be done as the nation of Israel fulfills its divine purpose. And God is certainly interested in having His will done. God takes no pleasure in our suffering, even when we have earned it. Ezekiel chapter 18, verse 32, and chapter 33, verse 11. Spiritual reform sometimes results in suffering, since we need to eliminate certain attitudes and behaviors. But even the suffering draws the compassion of God and of righteous people. We hasten to add that neither this verse nor any other Bible text implies that all suffering is deserved. Much is not. Compare Luke chapter 13, verses 1 through 5, and John chapter 9, verses 1 through 3. Thank you so much for listening. Join me soon for the next Read with Me. Stay safe and may God bless.